as we draw towards the end of the year, it's unlikely that we'll look back on 2024 as being a great year for weather. With lots of rain, a summer that never really seemed to get going, and some extremely stormy days, we've certainly seen a variety of weather this year. Well, vast am I, good afternoon, this is Ben Hartley, and for the next half hour on Manx Radio, I'll be joined by Senior Met Officer at Ronaldsway, Kirsty Pendlebury, to look back at some of the biggest weather events over the last 12 months. And one thing that may have been a disappointment or a relief for you was the general absence of snow. Whilst there was the inevitable covering over the hills at times, there was only one day this year, and that was the 18th of January, when we had a reasonable dusting at lower levels. However, it wasn't enough to close the schools or cause too much disruption, so I don't think we can call it a proper snow day. But we did have plenty of precipitation, certainly through the early part of the year, as Kirsty explains.
By the time we got to March, that was the fourth consecutive month we'd had above average rainfall. So quite a wet winter. Usually in March we have around about 63 millimetres of rain, and we had almost double that. So there was an awful lot of rain around. Temperatures then were above average because there was a lot of cloud as well. And it was very similar in April as well. That was the fifth consecutive month we had above average rainfall. In fact, by the time we got to April, 8 of the last 10 months were wetter than average, with July and April both being the wettest on record for Ronaldsway. So there'd been an awful lot of rain through the end of 23 and the beginning of 24. And throughout the whole month of April, we had 138 millimetres, which was actually just beat the record from 1961, which had 130 millimetres. And obviously our records go back to 1947, so that just shows quite how wet April was on the whole. There was temperatures were generally around or above average, really, because the amount of cloud cover is preventing really cold nights. And particularly as we went into sort of May as well, to be honest, May ended up being the warmest May on record for the Isle of Man, mainly due to the fact that we had quite mild nights. To be honest, we didn't really see those temperatures dropping off overnight and a risk of frost, which sometimes we get at that time of year. And during the daytime, to be honest, it wasn't really the top highest temperatures we'd ever seen. Basically, because we didn't have those higher temperatures during the day, it averaged out around slightly above average just because we didn't have the cold nights.
The warmest May on record, it's interesting because I'm just trying to think back. There was that really, really nice weekend. I think it was the weekend where we had that amazing sighting of the aurora. I think it was the second weekend of May. That was a particularly good one.
Yes, it was. Yeah, sort of around about the 10th of May, we ended up with slightly better conditions. Overall, by the end of May, we ended up with it being the warmest spring on record as well. But essentially, because of all the rain we'd had too.
Well, again, I think that's the perception, isn't it? We think of the summer as just not being great at all. So actually, May was fairly decent, I think, until we got to that crucial point of the year, and that is TT fortnight. The weather wasn't amazing for TT compared to last year when we had glorious conditions pretty much right through the fortnight. This TT, I tell you what I remember about it, is just how cold it felt at the grandstand. It really felt like a very cold TT this year.
Yeah, it really did, didn't it? I mean, it ended up with June that the mean daily maximum temperature was quite disappointing. It was only around 15.8 degrees, which was about half a degree less than what our long-term average is. And overall, it ended up being the coolest June since 2012. So it always makes it quite challenging at the best of times anyway. But it was certainly a bit breezy, a bit of cloud around as well. So it wasn't as easy as it was last year.
And there's no doubt about it, forecasting the weather at TT, as we've spoken about before, is a really difficult thing to do because you're trying to forecast the weather around a course that's 37 3/4 miles long, that comes down almost to sea level and then goes right up to almost the highest point on the island.
Yeah, and obviously very different conditions across the island. We're renowned for ending up with a shower that just crosses one part of the island, and I think we were really plagued with that in places this year where showers would move through at different times, catch different parts of the course. You then were waiting for that bit to dry out before another shower hit another part of it, and that really narrows the window of opportunity then for them to be able to get any racing done.
I think it's fair to say it was a really poor summer for 2024. We had some decent days in there, but we never really seemed this year to get a prolonged settled spell.
No, we didn't. I mean, much of July was cooler than average. There was only 2 days where we saw the temperature go above 20 degrees Celsius, and they were right at the end of the month. The last 5 days of the month, though, in July were a little bit better. We had some good conditions. It felt a little bit slightly more summery, which was quite handy because it sort of tied up well with seeing things like the Southern Agricultural Show and Gran Fondo. So at least some of the events through the summer didn't get completely washed out.
Going into August, actually, it was good for the Royal Show weekend as well. Both of the big agricultural events definitely got away with it this year, I think, although it was a bit windy on the Friday of the Royal Show.
Yes, but on the whole, still largely dry, which for both shows to get essentially nearly dry conditions is probably quite rare as well.
Unfortunately, though, for those who are fans of the Manx Grand Prix, they didn't get good conditions at all as we move towards the sort of middle to the end of August now for MGP. It really was miserable at times this year with a huge amount of disruption. And just thinking back, was that the sort of the wet conditions and the general murk around that time?
Yeah, it was very difficult, very challenging. August was very wet and windy. It was the second windiest August on record for us. It was compounded really by the fact that we had sort of ex-hurricane Ernesto coming through.
Ernesto! I'd forgotten about Ernesto. That was a thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he came through and gave us gusts of 50 miles an hour. And then the following night we had named Storm Lillian as well. So one of the last named storms of the season's conditions. And that brought an awful lot of rain, around 30 millimetres of rain as well. So just what you don't want when you're camping, really, strong winds and rain.
And this is it, something that wouldn't necessarily be unusual at this time of the year, but actually in August, that was a bit out of the ordinary.
Yeah, there's only been 3 other occasions at Ronaldsway that during August we've had gusts as high as that. So, and it also made conditions quite difficult, for highway workers and things like that. Obviously, they're trying to keep the course for the Grand Prix in a good condition, getting debris blown off onto the track. And also, we did have a period of quite high sort of coastal overtopping and inner harbour flooding around then as well. So, the certain members of the Department of Infrastructure were kept very busy.
So by the time we got to the end of the Manx Grand Prix, towards the end of August there, I think we had pretty much written off the summer as being anything decent. But then into September we went, temperatures rose, and we had a lot of sunshine and some really, really nice conditions through September.
Yeah, particularly the start of September was really lovely, and we ended up with the second warmest September day on record, which we saw 26.1 degrees Celsius measured at the Ronaldsway. That was on the 6th of September, and it also turned out to be the warmest day of the year as well. So that was the day. I don't know whether you can remember back to then.
So the warmest day of 2024 was in September. I mean, is that fairly unusual? Surely it's normally June, July, August when we get that hottest day.
Typically you would expect it during the summer really, but quite often the beginning of September I always joke the kids go back to school, the weather sometimes improves. Certainly seemed to be the case this year. It didn't last though, because we did see some cooler conditions coming in during the second half of September. So on the whole, actually, September ended up around average for the time of year, unbelievably.
We definitely made the most of it because I think we knew at that point it was absolutely the last blast of any decent weather for 2024, because then we moved into the autumn period. And of course, we start to get those named storms. So this year we had Ashley, I think, in October, which was sort of notable-ish. It was a bit lively, but nothing too much out of the ordinary with Ashley.
Yeah, that was when we had our first named storm. It was kind of a bit of a blip, really. Other than that, October was sort of unusually quite mild. And actually, as we headed towards the end of the month, we ended up with quite cloudy conditions, which continued on into November. And on the whole, for October, one of the unusual things is actually the diurnal temperature range between the maximum and minimum temperatures through the whole month was only 4 degrees. So we weren't seeing those really warm temperatures during the day. We weren't seeing cold temperatures at night. They were really staying in sort of a really quite small bracket, but it did lead to overall above average temperatures for October.
And one thing that I remember very much about the beginning of November was the fact that for the first couple of weeks it was sort of unseasonably mild for the time of year with very, very settled conditions.
Yeah, but it was very dull, wasn't it? We only had about 43 hours of sunshine as we're going through November in total. But from the 30th of October through until the 9th of November, we ended up with 11 days where we saw absolutely no sunshine recorded and burnt on the cards at Ronaldsway. So that beats a previous record of 10 days, which was from March 1969. So
Wow.
I'm not sure it's a record we really want to have. But
No, it was lovely to have the sort of settled conditions, but actually days and days without sunshine, actually to see no sunshine at all for that period of time, obviously is quite unusual.
yeah, it was. And especially when you start to get those darker nights as well after the clocks have changed, you felt like you were like shutting the curtains even earlier, weren't you, when it was so dark, and using the lights during the day and things.
But also unusual, I guess, to not have hardly any wind at all in those first couple of weeks in November. It was very still for the time of year.
Yeah, there was very little wind actually. It ended up being the third lowest on record. So yeah, on the whole, the mean wind speed throughout November was 11 knots, so an awful lot lower than what we've seen in previous years.
I was sort of looking back at this year as being a bit sort of not a huge amount has gone on, but actually there have been some sort of interesting, notable moments this year.
Yeah, I mean, we ended up with Storm Bert in November, which gave us quite a bit of rain in a short space of time. We ended up with about 53 millimetres of rain throughout November, and half of that fell during Storm Bert. And I think you might remember there was a little bit of flooding around the island as well.
Yeah,
particularly
Glen Helen.
some of the roads around
yeah.
Glen Helen were flooded, so it made very difficult conditions. A lot of that was down to how much rain fell in a short period of time. It sort of started in the early hours of the morning and was kind of gone by lunchtime, but it was quite a lot of rain just in that space of time, really.
We'll hear more from Kirsty shortly when we'll focus on one of the worst storms in recent years, and I think you know what we're talking about there. But how has the weather been for the island's farming industry over the last 12 months? Here's Manx Radio's farming correspondent, Kiri Kermode.
Well, Ben, it's certainly been challenging, put it that way. Early part of the year was just terribly wet, and it never really improved for the whole of 2024. We were desperately short of sunshine through the summer months. But the start of the year, when the rain came January time, then into lambing time, March and April, it was really, really difficult. There was a lot of lying water around the farms. It wasn't clearing up. A lot of the days were very misty. There wasn't any evaporation at all. So it was very difficult through lambing time, and it really did take its toll on farmers across the island, which is always quite painful. But then throughout the rest of the summer, the rain set in. We had a couple of good sunny weekends for the agricultural shows, but thereafter it's been one thing after another.
Well, you make a good point there, as we said to Kirsty a little earlier, that the agricultural shows, I mean, usually one of them is affected. It's often
Yes,
the southern
absolutely.
show, isn't it, that seems to cop the worst of the weather. But amazingly, throughout a summer which really didn't sort of give us any prolonged settled spell, the 2 weekends of both the southern and the royal show were really, really good.
They were so good, and I think everybody enjoyed themselves, especially from the farming community. But that said, there was still a lot of haymaking being done on those days. So there's farming friends that would generally attend the shows were not about. They were very much at home, taking full advantage of getting their crops in and in the dry and harvested well. Now, Kirsty's probably explained more of how weather is changing over the decades, but we're seeing it in the farming community that when that comes, you have to really plan your business week around the weather. And I know farmers always complain about the weather, but more so, it's absolutely critical to get that quality hay made for the feedstocks for the winter ahead.
Are you constantly listening to the weather forecast and keeping an eye on how things are sort of panning out that day and probably a few days ahead?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. I think we have it open on the laptop all of the time, down to Kirsty and the team there at Ronaldsway, the Met Office, to see what's coming and obviously plan your weeks. But also when the dry weather comes, we only have limited amount of contractors on the Isle of Man that come in and make the hay bales and get the grass cut. So we're all trying to fit in with him or her to try and get the jobs done.
And as you say, we've had a lot of rain this year, particularly in the first half of the year during the lambing season. Difficult time of the year anyway, you're up at all hours, but if it's wet and miserable, it must make things so much more difficult.
It is really, really difficult. And not only is it physically difficult, it's just mentally draining as well. You have to try and get if you're lambing inside, for example, you have to try and get the lambs out to grass, out away from the bugs. The winter environment inside, there's all sorts of bacteria builds up at that time of year. So you're just desperate to get them out into the fields to enjoy the sun on their backs. But it can be prolonged weeks and months of rain and miserable weather. You've got to make sure you've managed your feedstocks correctly, that you've got the dates of your calendar sorted out, so when you start lambing, when you finish. I know that just at home on our farm, in the time that I've been farming with my family, we've moved our lambing period from early February. We're lambing now right out in the middle of April to try and get the better weather or hit the better weather. So seasons have definitely changed in the short time I've been farming at home. So it can be very, very demanding at lambing time.
Now, one of the biggest weather events this year, no, not one of the biggest, the biggest, I think it's fair to say, was earlier this month when Storm Darragh absolutely battered us. So for you down in the south of the island on your farm, how was it for you? Did you suffer quite badly on the day?
We were quite lucky compared to some of the other farms around the Isle of Man, especially on the west coast. I do believe a lot of slate damage was done and some of the barns were really impacted. Where we have our cattle housing, it's actually on top of the hill outside Ballasalla, and that really did take a pasting. It was away from the main farm steading, which is on lower ground, but luckily we didn't have too much livestock in the building, but the doors came off one end, blew out the other end. It was really quite horrific. Thankfully it was in the daytime, so you could keep an eye and monitor what was going on. But these big disasters are coming in fits and starts, whether it's snow or whether it's the wind. They are creating an awful lot of damage when it impacts.
And financially, in terms of the damage that something like Storm Darragh can potentially do, a lot of money must have to be spent repairing this damage if sheds and buildings and so forth are affected by the wind.
No, absolutely it is. Insurance companies are very good to support the farming industry, and I know that they're going to be under pressure in the next few months trying to get some of the damage rectified and working hand in hand. But obviously it is something that the insurance companies are aware of, these big events. They're coming every couple of years or so now, so financially it's something we've got to think about as a business and put aside in case for any eventuality.
I don't know if this sounds like a daft question or not, but when you've got such windy conditions, do you have to think about the animals and their safety in wind like that? Do you have to sort of bring them into the sheds or sort of closer to the buildings? Is that something you have to consider?
Absolutely. So when it was said that the storm was on its way, we do have a few fields that have got very poor shelter. With the new modern ways of farming, lots of the old Manx hedges were taken out of some of the land that we rent, so they're just very much structured by a fence around the edge, but no Manx sod hedge or a gorse bush or anything like that. It's all been taken away.
It's not going to give you much shelter.
This is it. So we had to move them off into lower ground or into more areas where there's more trees or more gorse, and it definitely does break that wind from them. But again, we can't thank Ronaldsway enough for giving us that information in good time.
And thanks very much to Kiri Kermode. Well, let's look a bit more closely now at that day just under 3 weeks ago, when the island was waking up to somewhat stormy conditions.
Manx Radio News at 8 o'clock Moromai. I'm Lewis Foster. Storm Darragh is causing widespread disruption and damage around the island. The advice for motorists is to avoid all non-essential travel.
It was the early hours of Saturday morning, the 7th of December, when Storm Darragh well and truly arrived, as Kirsty explains.
Yeah, I was on shift that night, and the increase in the wind in the space of about 15 minutes was just absolutely incredible. It went from meaning sort of 15 knots at the airport to gusting nearly 55 knots, and the rumble on the roof of the building, I'm sure that woke everybody up. It happened somewhere around about 3:30, 3:45 as it spread across the island, and yeah, it was really notable.
Have you ever seen an increase that quickly before in the wind speed?
No, I obviously was expecting it to increase very quickly. We knew that within a 1 to 2 hour period it was going to go from like a force 3 to 4 up to severe gales to storm force winds, so we knew that was going to happen. But to actually experience it and just to see the wind trace on the screen in the office of quite how quickly that picked up, and I'd actually just got off a meeting with the tactical group, giving them an update on it, and I said, I know it doesn't seem like it right now, but very soon you are going to start to see those winds picking up. And literally we got off the phone call, and 5 minutes later I was telling them, yeah, it's already happening here now.
And once that wind really did build, it was the fact that it just remained so constant, that wind. Like we say, Bert was kind of done and dusted within a few hours, but Storm Darragh continued on, I think, for the best part of 24 hours, and that is unusual. Yeah,
we knew that the winds were at least going to stay severe gale force through much of the day into the evening, and the storm force winds were going to be predominantly sort of from 3-4 in the morning until sort of like lunchtime, but it just didn't feel like it got any better, did it, all day? And the sound, it was just so loud. I think one of the things that maybe compounded the issue and made it more noticeable, obviously, that we had so many trees and things come down, but we'd had like a severe gale force southeasterly wind on the Friday evening before the winds dropped out and before the low centre tracked across. And then the winds picked up from a north-northwesterly, which is almost 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So all the trees are being blown blown from the southeast, and then like less than sort of 8 hours later they're getting blown from the opposite direction.
Which again must be unusual, is it, for it to do such almost a turn on a sixpence?
Yeah, I mean, quite often we get these areas of low pressure that move through, and we will get the winds sort of, as we call it, going round the clock, changing direction constantly. And quite often we do end up with the northwesterlies, but this northwesterly was almost enhanced by the fact there was a massive area of high pressure out in the mid-Atlantic that was sort of trying to build a ridge in and push the low centre away to the east. And it just meant that we just saw this massive surge of pressure across the British Isles, and with that then these really strong winds, and it just took such a long time for them to slowly ease. I mean, even through Sunday we still had gale force winds. It really took until Monday morning before we were sort of back to sort of non-gale force.
Yeah, that's it. So 48 hours really of sort of at least gale force winds with storm force at times. What were the sort of highest wind speeds and where were they throughout the sort of worst of Storm Darragh?
So the worst that we had at Ronaldsway, we had 79 miles an hour, and that was actually at 9 o'clock in the morning. But we had a peak sort of around about 4:30 in the morning, and then we had a second peak of that gust at 9 o'clock. And it was a similar time as well that we saw the highest gust at Peel Breakwater, which was 82 miles an hour, which obviously was very exposed because of the northwesterly direction as well. We did have slightly lighter winds on the east side of the island, like Douglas Breakwater had 53. So actually, in comparison to sort of southern and western parts, I mean, Point of Ayre had 73. So anywhere that was a bit more exposed certainly had those sort of stronger winds, a little bit more sheltered maybe on the east side of the island.
How did we look over the mountain during the worst of it?
So at the mountain box, we had 65 miles an hour and 70 at Brandywell, but obviously the top of Snowfell is sort of 2,000 feet up, and we did see sort of 96 up there at the top of Snowfell. So yeah, you wouldn't have wanted to be up there on that day. I mean,
this is what's interesting. You know, part of your job comes, as you say, working with the sort of government teams, the tactical advisors, and huge amount of disruption to transport. I think everything was halted that day in terms of flights, sailings, and buses as well.
Yeah, it was very difficult situation, really. I mean, obviously the conditions for the Irish Sea were very unpleasant. We sort of saw that with the coastal overtopping around the island as well. But for the airport even, I mean, quite often we end up with the winds sometimes turning and being almost down the direction of the runway, and it makes it a bit easier. But it was a crosswind all day, so obviously it was out of limits for most of all of the aircraft all day. And yes, we didn't end up seeing with any flights leaving or coming into the island.
Now, I think it was a good 24 hours before the storm really hit that you'd said actually we're going to put an amber warning out for Storm Darragh for severe gales, storm force winds. How difficult is it for you and the team at Ronaldsway to actually sort of work out what colour of warning you want to put out, particularly when you're watching the Met Office in Ireland and across in the UK as well, and they issued some red warnings in places? Yeah,
they did, and we were certainly very aware of that. We were constantly monitoring the situation, checking with the latest computer model data. Up until about 4 days before, the models had been really inconsistent and were changing the track of the low, the depth of the low, and that was making it quite difficult. And then when we got to about Wednesday, finally the models started to all come into line with each other, where it was going to track, how strong the winds were going to be, and generally speaking after that it became quite consistent. So that's what made it quite easy for us to give a couple of days warning and put out an amber, and to know that it was going to be an amber. But it was always mentioned to everybody, this is probably the top end of an amber. Once we get towards sort of 80 miles an hour or above, quite widespreadly across the island, that's usually where it would tend to tip into a red for us. And as I said, Peel did see 82, but it's that kind of balance of, there are storms that we've seen where we've had worse wind conditions than this. So when you want to put a red warning out, you really want to make sure that people take note of it.
Yeah, you don't do it lightly at all, do you? Yeah. No, absolutely, because if you do too many, then they lose effect. So it's a very difficult balancing act for you and the team on this one.
Yeah, very much so. And it was monitored all the way through. We still had a warning drafted, ready to go in case we needed it. But all the model data came in and we kept saying, well, it's probably not going to be widespreadly over 80. We knew that the worst conditions were always expected for like parts of Wales and southwest England, around the Bristol Channel area. And so we kind of wanted to make sure that our emphasis was correct. Like I said, I think we saw we would also take into account the fact it happened on a Saturday morning. It happened quite early, so we didn't have people out already on the island's roads trying to get home.
Schools aren't in, are they? So that obviously makes a bit of a difference.
Yeah, there's more chance of it having potentially have been a red if it was during a weekday, where we knew that the conditions are going to be more impactful because people would be already up and about and moving around. But I think because the flights had been cancelled the night before, we knew the airport was going to be shut, the boats weren't going to happen. A lot of events had cancelled already anyway. It meant that there was a lot less people on the roads, and although there was a lot of trees and that was very difficult and challenging for all the agencies on the island to try and keep the roads open, I think actually it probably helped a lot that there wasn't lots of people trying to move around the island at the same time.
So many of us, the weekend of Storm Darragh, said, well, this is one of the worst of recent times. So where does Darragh sit within sort of previous storms over the years?
So in terms of getting over sort of 65 knots at the airport, or 74 miles an hour, so we got 79 with this one. The last time we had over 74 miles an hour was actually with ex-Hurricane Ophelia. And I remember forecasting for that, and we had a violent Storm 11 in the shipping forecast for that as well. So that was on the 16th of October 2017. So a few years ago, but not like 10 years ago,
Yeah.
And in the last 10 years, we've now had, including Storm Darragh, we've now had 4 times where we've had gusts of over 74 miles an hour at Ronaldsway. So 4 in the last 10 years, that's why I was saying sometimes you want to save that red warning for when it's just that little bit higher, just to make sure that the messaging to the public is really proves that this is going to be something to take note of. One of the main things for us was particularly once we got into Saturday, the team were doing amazing work, but they were on briefings almost every couple of hours with the tactical weather group, the strategic group for the island, making sure that the latest conditions were given the information out to them, the agencies, to work out when was it going to get any better. The decisions obviously kept being made about whether the buses were going to keep operating. So there was an awful lot of information still getting passed out to members of the public and making sure that everyone was kept as safe as possible.
Saturday, the 7th of December, Storm Darragh, something I think many of us will remember for a long, long time. Kirsty, it's been great to catch up with you once again, and thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you and all the team a very Merry Christmas and very best wishes for 2025, and hopefully lots of sunshine in the summer. Can you sort that for us next summer?
I will try my best. I'll put the order in now.
And thanks again to Kirsty Pendlebury from Ronaldsway Met Office for joining us for this special programme this afternoon, looking back at the weather the Isle of Man has experienced throughout 2024. And here on Manx Radio, we'll keep you right up to date with the weather as we go throughout the Christmas and New Year period and into 2025. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. This programme will shortly be available as a podcast at manxradio.com.